I remember the way the light crept through the kitchen window that morning, painting golden stripes across the faded linoleum. The kettle was already whistling, and the scent of Earl Grey mingled with the faint aroma of toast. My mother stood by the sink, her back to me, shoulders hunched in that familiar way that always made her seem smaller than she was. I watched her for a moment, memorizing the curve of her neck, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she reached for her favorite teacup, the one with the blue forget-me-nots chipped at the rim from years of use. We didn't speak at first. The silence between us was thick but not hostile, just heavy with all the things we'd never quite learned to say. I wanted to ask her if she'd slept, if the dreams had come again, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I busied myself with the butter dish, spreading it over the toast in slow, deliberate strokes, as if I could smooth away the tension with each pass of the knife. She finally turned, her eyes meeting mine. There was a tiredness there, a kind of resignation I'd noticed more and more in recent months. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. Couldn't sleep. The truth was, I'd been lying awake for hours, listening to the house settle, counting the seconds between the creaks and sighs, wondering if she was awake too. We sat together at the table, the silence stretching out, punctuated only by the clink of her spoon against the china. I studied her hands, so much older than I remembered, veins like rivers beneath thin skin. She wore her wedding ring, though my father had been gone for years. I wondered if she still talked to him in the quiet moments, if she asked him for advice on how to handle me, her grown daughter who still felt like a child in her presence. I tried to recall the last time we'd laughed together. Really laughed, the kind that left us breathless and wiping tears from our eyes. It felt like a lifetime ago. Lately our conversations had been careful, tiptoeing around old wounds. She worried about me, I knew, about my job, my marriage, the way I seemed to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. But she never said it outright. Instead, she fussed over my tea, made sure I had enough to eat, pressed a hand to my forehead when I looked tired. That morning, though, there was a distance in her gaze, as if she was already somewhere else. She asked about my plans for the day, and I rattled off a list of errands, groceries, the post office, maybe a walk if the weather held. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. Her mind was far away, lost in thoughts she didn't share. I wanted to reach across the table to take her hand and ask her what was wrong. But pride or maybe fear kept me rooted in place. Instead, I offered her more toast and she smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After breakfast, she stood and gathered her things. Her purse, her cardigan, the scarf I'd knitted for her last Christmas. She moved slowly as if each motion required great effort. I watched her slip on her shoes by the door, her fingers fumbling with the laces. I almost asked her where she was going, but something in her posture stopped me. She'd always valued her independence, and I'd learned not to pry. She paused in the doorway, turning back to look at me. For a moment, I thought she might say something important, something that would explain the heaviness in the air. But she just smiled again, that same wistful curve of her lips, and said, "Don't forget to water the plants." I nodded, promising I would, though I hated the way her words sounded like a goodbye. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was left alone in the quiet house. I stood there for a long time, listening to the echo of her footsteps fading down the path. I told myself she'd be back soon, that she was just going for a walk, maybe to the market or to visit a friend. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, a knot of unease began to form in my chest. I tried to distract myself with chores, washing dishes, folding laundry, dusting the shelves where her porcelain figurines stood in neat rows. But every sound made me jump. Every creak of the floorboard sent my heart racing. I checked the clock again and again, willing the minutes to pass faster, hoping she'd walk through the door with a bag of groceries and a story about someone she'd met on the way. By afternoon, worry had settled into something darker. I called her friends, the neighbors, even the little bakery she liked on Main Street. No one had seen her. I walked the neighborhood, retracing the route she usually took, scanning the faces of strangers, searching for any sign of her. The world felt suddenly vast and unfamiliar, every shadow a threat, every silence a warning. As evening fell, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I clutched her teacup in my hands, tracing the chipped rim with my thumb, desperate for some sense of connection. I replayed our last conversation over and over, searching for clues in her words, her tone, the way she looked at me before she left. I told myself she'd be back by morning, that this was just a misunderstanding, a blip in the routine of our lives. But deep down I knew something had changed. The house felt emptier than it ever had, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. That night, I lay awake, listening for the sound of her key in the lock, the familiar creak of the floorboards as she made her way to her room. But the house remained silent, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. I never saw her again. Until 5 years later. The morning after my mother disappeared, the world felt both too loud and eerily silent. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, their song sharp and insistent, as if they were trying to rouse me from a nightmare. For a moment, I almost believed it had all been a bad dream, that I'd find her in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured her tea. But the house was empty, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, each second a reminder that she was still gone. I moved through the day in a daze, my mind replaying every detail of her departure. Had I missed something? A sign, a plea for help, a goodbye hidden in her eyes? I called her phone again and again, listening to her voice on the answering machine. The familiar warmth now a cruel echo. I left messages, my words growing more frantic with each call until my voice cracked and I could say nothing at all. By noon, I'd called the police. They arrived with their notepads and polite, practiced concern, asking questions I struggled to answer. When did you last see her? Was she upset? Did she have any reason to leave? I tried to remember every detail, but my mind was a jumble of images, her hands trembling as she tied her scarf, the way she lingered in the doorway, the sadness in her smile. I told them about her routine, her friends, the places she liked to visit. They nodded, jotting down notes, their faces unreadable. Word spread quickly. Neighbors stopped by, their faces a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Some brought casseroles as if food could fill the void she'd left behind. Others offered theories, whispered suggestions that maybe she'd simply needed a break, that she'd grown tired of the quiet life we led. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I was screaming. How could they not understand? My mother would never just leave. Not without a word, not without a reason. My daughter Emily came over that afternoon, her face pale and drawn. She hugged me tightly, her arms trembling. "We'll find her, Mom," she whispered, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We sat together in the living room, the silence between us heavy with fear. Emily tried to distract me, talking about her job, her friends, the little things that usually made me smile. But nothing could pierce the fog of worry that had settled over me. As the hours passed, the house filled with people, family, friends, even distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. They gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, casting worried glances in my direction. I felt like a ghost in my own home, drifting from room to room, searching for something I couldn't name. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt, only to sink again when it was another well-meaning friend or a police officer with no news. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me. I remembered the way my mother used to sit there, her hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she listened to my stories. I thought of the arguments we'd had over trivial things mostly, the way she'd worried about me, her gentle nagging about my health, my work, my tendency to take on too much. I'd always brushed her off, insisting I was fine, that I didn't need her hovering. Now I would have given anything to hear her voice, to feel her hand on my shoulder, to argue with her one more time. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Where was she? Was she safe? Had I done something to drive her away? Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. I replayed our last conversation, searching for clues, for some hint of what she'd been feeling. Had I missed a cry for help? Had I been too wrapped up in my own worries to see her pain? The days blurred together, each one a haze of phone calls, police visits, and endless waiting. I tried to keep busy, to distract myself with chores and errands, but nothing could fill the emptiness inside me. I found myself wandering the house, touching her things, her favorite sweater draped over the armchair, the book she'd been reading, the half-finished crossword on the kitchen table. Each object was a reminder of her absence, a piece of her I couldn't let go. Emily stayed with me for the first few nights, sleeping on the couch, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of all I'd lost. We tried to support each other, but the strain began to show. She grew impatient with the police, frustrated by their lack of progress. I snapped at her over small things, the way she left her shoes in the hallway, the mess she made in the kitchen. We were both on edge, our nerves frayed by worry and exhaustion. One evening, after another fruitless day of searching, Emily confronted me. "You have to eat, Mom," she said, her voice tight with concern. I shook my head, unable to swallow the food she'd prepared. "I can't," I whispered. Not until she's home. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be. The one who'd clung to my hand on the first day of school, terrified of being left behind. Now it was my turn to be afraid, to feel lost and alone. In the quiet moments, memories flooded back, some painful, others bittersweet. I remembered the time my mother and I had argued over my decision to move out, her fear that I was growing up too fast. I'd shouted, slammed the door, certain I didn't need her anymore. But later that night, she'd slipped into my room, sat on the edge of my bed and stroked my hair until I fell asleep. She never held a grudge, never let anger linger between us. I thought of the afternoons we'd spent in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, teaching me the names of every flower. She'd laugh when I mixed them up, her voice warm and patient. "It's all right, darling," she'd say. "You'll learn." Those moments felt like lifetimes ago, fragments of a world I could never return to. As the days stretched into weeks, hope began to fade. The police found no trace of her, no sightings, no clues, nothing to explain her disappearance. The community rallied around me at first, but as time passed, their visits grew less frequent, their concern replaced by awkward silence. Some whispered that she'd run away, that she'd grown tired of her life, of me. Others hinted at darker possibilities, their eyes full of pity. I tried to ignore the rumors, but they seeped into my thoughts, feeding my guilt and self-doubt. Had I been too hard on her? Had I missed the signs of her unhappiness? I replayed every conversation, every argument, searching for answers I would never find. My relationship with Emily suffered. She grew distant, spending more time at work, avoiding the house that had become a shrine to my mother's memory. We argued more often, our words sharp and defensive. She accused me of giving up, of wallowing in grief. I accused her of moving on too quickly, of not caring enough. The truth was, we were both lost, both searching for a way to make sense of the senseless. One night, after a particularly bitter argument, I found myself alone in the garden, the air cool and still. I knelt by the rose bushes my mother had planted, my hands trembling as I traced the petals. I remembered her laughter, her patience, the way she'd always known how to comfort me. I wept for all the things I'd never said, for the apologies I'd never made, for the love I'd taken for granted. In those days that followed, I learned how fragile life could be, how quickly everything you cherish can slip through your fingers. I clung to memories, to the hope that she would return, that we would have another chance. But as the days turned to weeks and the weeks to months, I began to realize that some wounds never truly heal. They become a part of you, a scar that reminds you of what you've lost and of the love that endures, even in absence. The first week after my mother vanished, I became a woman possessed. I scoured the neighborhood, calling her name until my voice was hoarse, my feet aching from pounding the same cracked sidewalks she'd walked for years. Emily and I made flyers, her neat handwriting spelling out "missing" above a photo that suddenly looked too old, as if my mother had already become a memory. We taped them to lampposts, slipped them into mailboxes, handed them to strangers who offered polite nods and empty promises to keep an eye out. The police did what they could, or so they said. They searched the parks, the bus stops, the little shops my mother liked to visit. They asked questions, took statements, and left me with a case number that felt cold and impersonal. I watched them comb through her belongings, their gloved hands rifling through drawers and closets, looking for clues I was terrified they might find. Every knock at the door made my heart leap with hope and dread in equal measure. Neighbors formed search parties, their flashlights bobbing through the dusk as they called her name into the gathering dark. For a while, the community rallied around us, offering casseroles, rides, and prayers. But as the days dragged on, their concern faded, replaced by awkward glances and whispered speculation. I could feel their eyes on me at the grocery store, their voices dropping to a hush as I passed. Some offered sympathy, but others looked at me with suspicion, as if I might be hiding something, as if a daughter could simply misplace her mother. I tried to hold myself together, to be strong for Emily, but inside I was unraveling. Every night I replayed the last morning over and over, searching for something I'd missed, a word, a gesture, a sign that she was planning to leave. Shame gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. Had I been too distracted, too wrapped up in my own worries to notice her pain? Had I pushed her away with my impatience, my stubbornness, my need to always be right? The questions multiplied, each one heavier than the last. I found myself apologizing to her empty room, whispering confessions into the darkness. "I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I took you for granted. I'm sorry I let you leave without telling you how much I needed you." The silence in the house was suffocating. pressing in on me from all sides. I left the radio on, the television blaring, anything to drown out the echo of her absence. Emily tried to help, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She juggled work and the search, her own grief simmering beneath the surface. We snapped at each other over small things, missed phone calls, forgotten appointments. The way I hovered by the window waiting for news that never came. She accused me of giving up, of wallowing in guilt, and I accused her of moving on too quickly. The truth was, we were both lost, both desperate for answers that refused to come. The police interviews grew more pointed as the weeks passed. They asked about our relationship, about arguments and secrets, about money and wills. I felt their unspoken questions hanging in the air. Did she leave on purpose? Was she running from something or someone? I tried to answer honestly, but every word felt like a betrayal, a confession of my own failings as a daughter. I wondered if they saw the cracks in my composure, the guilt etched into every line of my face. Rumors began to swirl, carried on the same breeze that rustled the flyers on the telephone poles. Some said she'd run away to start a new life, tired of the routines and responsibilities that had defined her for so long. Others whispered darker theories, their eyes lingering on me a moment too long. I tried to ignore them, but their words seeped into my thoughts, feeding my self-doubt and shame. I found myself withdrawing from the world, avoiding friends and neighbors, letting calls go unanswered. The house became my refuge and my prison, each room haunted by memories of my mother's laughter, her gentle touch, her quiet strength. I wandered from room to room, touching her things, her favorite sweater, her gardening gloves, the book she'd left open on the nightstand. Each object was a reminder of her absence, a question I couldn't answer. At night, the silence was the worst. I lay awake, listening for the sound of her key in the lock, the creak of the floorboards as she made her way to her room. But the house remained still, the darkness pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I tried to pray, to bargain with whatever force might be listening. Bring her back, I begged. Let me see her one more time. Let me say goodbye. As the weeks turned into months, hope became a fragile, flickering thing. The search parties dwindled, the police visits grew less frequent, and the world moved on without us. Emily returned to her own life, calling less often, her voice tight with worry and frustration. I understood she needed to heal, to find her own way forward. But I couldn't let go. I clung to the hope that my mother would walk through the door, that everything would return to the way it was. But deep down, I knew the truth. The world had shifted, leaving me stranded in a place where answers were scarce and comfort even scarcer. The silence in the house became a living thing, wrapping itself around me, whispering doubts and regrets. I felt invisible, abandoned not just by my mother, but by the community, by the world, even by my own family. In the end, it was the silence that hurt the most. The absence of her voice, her laughter, her love. It was a wound that refused to heal, a reminder that sometimes the people we need most are the ones we lose without warning, leaving us to search for answers in the quiet spaces they leave behind. The years after my mother disappeared did not pass so much as accumulate, one atop the other, like dust on the mantle she used to polish every Sunday. First, I marked time by the day, how many mornings I woke to find her bed still made, her slippers untouched by the door. Then by the week, the month, the season. Eventually, the ache of her absence became a dull companion, a shadow that followed me through every ordinary moment. Birthdays came and went, each one quieter than the last. The first year, Emily insisted on baking a cake, her hands trembling as she frosted the edges, trying to keep tradition alive. We sang half-heartedly, our voices faltering in the empty kitchen. I set a place for my mother at the table, her favorite teacup waiting beside a slice of cake she would never taste. Afterward, I washed the cup and put it back in the cupboard, unable to bear the sight of it lingering on the table. A silent accusation. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas lost its sparkle. The tree smaller each year, the ornaments fewer. I hung her stocking by the fireplace, filling it with little things she used to love. Lavender soap, a crossword puzzle, a tin of her favorite tea. I told myself it was for hope, for the possibility that she might return. But deep down I knew it was for me, a ritual to keep her memory alive. On New Year's Eve, I wrote her a letter in the diary she'd given me years before. The one with the worn leather cover and her handwriting on the first page. For all your stories, big and small. I filled its pages with confessions, apologies, and questions that would never be answered. Emily moved out the second year, her visits growing less frequent, as she built a life of her own. I understood. She needed to escape the weight of our grief, to find joy in places untouched by loss. Still, Each time she left, the house seemed to shrink, the silence pressing in a little tighter. I tried to fill the emptiness with routine, gardening, volunteering at the library, joining a book club I never truly belonged to. But nothing could fill the space my mother had left behind. I became adept at hiding my pain, offering polite smiles and practiced reassurances to friends who asked after me. "I'm fine," I'd say, "just keeping busy." But at night, when the world was quiet, I would sit at the kitchen table with her teacup in my hands, tracing the chipped rim with my thumb, willing myself to remember the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her embrace. Some nights I would open her diary and read her old entries, lists of groceries, notes about the garden, little reminders to herself. Each word was a thread connecting me to her, fragile but unbroken. As the years passed, I felt myself harden, the raw edges of my grief smoothing into something colder, more manageable. I stopped expecting her to walk through the door, stopped jumping at the sound of footsteps on the porch. I learned to live with the not knowing, to accept that some questions would remain unanswered, but the longing never faded. It lived in the quiet moments when I caught a glimpse of her favorite scarf in the closet, or found a note she'd tucked into a book, her handwriting looping and familiar. Milestones came and went. Emily's graduation, her first job, the day she announced she was moving across the country. I smiled and celebrated, but each joy was tinged with sorrow, a reminder of all my mother was missing. I wanted to call her, to share the news, to hear her pride and excitement. Instead, I wrote it all down in the diary, hoping that somehow, somewhere, she would know. The world moved on, but I remained tethered to the past, anchored by the objects she'd left behind. The teacup, the diary, the scarf she wore on chilly mornings, each one a relic of a life interrupted. I dusted them, cared for them, spoke to them as if they could answer back. They became my companions, my witnesses, my proof that she had been real, that our love had existed. 5 years is a long time to live in limbo, to balance hope and resignation in equal measure. I learned to carry my grief quietly, to let it shape me without defining me. But some nights, when the house was especially still, I would close my eyes and imagine her sitting across from me, her hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes full of understanding. In those moments, the ache of her absence softened, and I allowed myself to believe that love, once given, never truly disappears. It lingers, like the scent of her perfume in the hallway, a promise that I was not alone, even in the silence. It was a Tuesday morning, 5 years to the week since my mother vanished, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I'd grown used to silence, to letting calls go to voicemail, to the world moving on without me, but something in the way the phone kept ringing, insistent, urgent, made me pick up. It was Margaret, my oldest friend, her voice breathless and trembling. "Turn on Channel 7, she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Now please, you need to see this," my heart stuttered. I fumbled for the remote, hands shaking as I pressed the buttons. The television flickered to life, the morning news anchor's voice cutting through the quiet. At first it was just background noise, footage of a city street, police tape fluttering in the breeze, a crowd of onlookers gathered behind the barricades. I almost asked Margaret what I was supposed to be looking for, but then the camera panned, and I saw her. My mother. She was older, thinner, her hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a way I'd never seen before. Her clothes were plain, almost shabby, and there was a haunted look in her eyes that made my breath catch. But it was her, unmistakably her, standing on the edge of the crowd, speaking to a police officer with a mixture of urgency and fear. The news anchor's words faded into a dull roar as I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Margaret's voice crackled through the phone. "Is that? It can't be, can it?" I couldn't answer. I pressed my hand to my mouth, tears springing to my eyes. For years I'd imagined this moment, her face appearing in a crowd, a chance encounter on the street, a letter in the mail. But nothing had prepared me for the shock of seeing her on the news, alive but changed, a stranger and yet so achingly familiar. The reporter's voice cut through my thoughts, describing a disturbance at a downtown shelter, a woman found wandering the streets, disoriented and refusing to give her name. The camera zoomed in, and I saw the way my mother's hands fluttered at her sides, the way she glanced over her shoulder as if searching for someone. I wanted to reach through the screen, to call out to her, to tell her I was here, that I'd never stopped looking. The footage was brief, just a few seconds, but it was enough. I watched it over and over, my mind racing with questions. Where had she been all these years? Why hadn't she come home? What had happened to her? The news anchor moved on to another story, but I barely heard it. My world had narrowed to that single image. My mother, alive, standing in the middle of a city I barely recognized. Margaret was still on the line, her voice shaky. "You have to call the police. Tell them it's her. Maybe they can help." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, my thoughts spinning. I wanted to believe this was the answer I'd been waiting for, the miracle I'd stopped daring to hope for. But fear crept in, cold and sharp. What if she didn't want to be found? What if she'd chosen this new life, whatever it was, over the one she'd left behind? I hung up with Margaret and sat in stunned silence. The image of my mother burned into my mind. I thought of the years I'd spent searching, the nights I'd lain awake imagining every possible fate. I'd pictured her lost, hurt, even dead, but never this. Never alive and so close, yet so impossibly far away. I called Emily, my hands trembling as I tried to explain. She was silent for a long moment, then said, "Are you sure it was her?" I told her I'd know my mother's face anywhere, no matter how much time had passed. Emily promised to come, over, her voice tight with worry and something else, hope, maybe, or fear. I spent the rest of the day glued to the television, waiting for another glimpse, another clue. I called the police, gave them the details, begged them to look into it. They promised to follow up, but I could hear the skepticism in their voices. Another missing person, another desperate family clinging to hope. As night fell, I sat at the kitchen table, the diary open in front of me, my mother's teacup cradled in my hands. I wrote down everything I'd seen, every detail I could remember, afraid that if I didn't, it would all slip away like a dream. The house felt different now, charged with possibility, with questions that refused to be silenced. Why was she there? And why didn't she come home? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with images of my mother's face on the television, her eyes darting, her hands restless. I called the police again at dawn, pressing for any update, any sign that they'd found her. They promised to call if they learned anything, but I couldn't wait. I needed to see her with my own eyes, to know that she was real and not just a ghost conjured by years of longing. I spent the morning calling every shelter, hospital, and outreach center in the city. Most had no idea what I was talking about, but finally, a tired-sounding woman at a downtown shelter paused when I described my mother. "We had someone like that come in yesterday," she said. "Didn't give her name. Left before breakfast, I'm sorry." My heart sank, but I pressed on, asking if she'd seen which way my mother had gone. "She was heading toward the river," the woman said. "Looked lost. I hope you find her." I drove into the city, the streets unfamiliar and crowded, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I parked near the river and walked for hours, scanning every face, searching for the woman I'd lost. The city was loud and indifferent, people rushing past with their own burdens, their own stories. I felt invisible, a stranger in a place that should have felt like home. It was late afternoon when I saw her. She was sitting on a bench by the water, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her hair was pulled back, streaked with gray, and she wore a faded coat that hung loosely on her frame. For a moment I hesitated, afraid that if I approached she might vanish again, slip away like a dream. But then she turned, and our eyes met. I walked toward her, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. She watched me come, her expression unreadable. I stopped a few feet away, unsure what to say, how to bridge the chasm of years and silence that separated us. "Hello, Mum," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze searching my face as if trying to remember who I was. Then, quietly, she said, "You found me." I sat beside her, leaving a careful space between us. The river flowed past, indifferent to our reunion, the city's noise a distant hum. For a while, neither of us spoke. I studied her profile, the lines etched deeper, the familiar curve of her jaw. She looked older, yes, but also harder, as if the world had carved away the softness I remembered. "I saw you on the news," I said finally. I thought you were gone." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the water. I was, in a way. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but something held me back. Instead, I asked, "Why didn't you come home?" She flinched just slightly, and I saw a flicker of pain cross her face. "It wasn't that simple," she said. "I couldn't." I waited, hoping she would say more, but she only shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. I felt a surge of frustration, of anger and relief tangled together. "You left without a word. We searched everywhere. Emily, she thought you were dead." I thought. My voice broke, and I looked away, blinking back tears. She was silent for a long time. Then softly she said, "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." The words hung between us, heavy with all the things left unsaid. I wanted to demand answers, to know where she'd been, what had happened to her, why she'd chosen to disappear. But I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of her own secrets. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled, a small, sad smile that reminded me of the morning she left. "I'm alive," she said. "That's something." We sat in silence, the river glinting in the late afternoon sun. I tried to remember the last time we'd been together like this, just the two of us, sharing a quiet moment. It felt like another lifetime. "I kept your things," I said, desperate to fill the silence. "Your teacup, your diary. I wrote to you sometimes. I didn't know if you'd ever read it, but it helped." She looked at me then, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said. "I thought about you, every day." I swallowed hard, the ache in my chest almost unbearable. "Why, Mum, why did you leave?" She closed her eyes, her hands twisting in her lap. "I was lost," she said finally. "I needed to find myself. I know that sounds selfish, but I couldn't breathe. Not there, not anymore." I tried to understand, to see the world through her eyes. Had I missed the signs? Had I been so wrapped up in my own life that I hadn't seen her slipping away? Guilt and anger warred inside me, but above all there was relief. She was alive, she was here, even if she was changed. "Emily wants to see you," I said. "She's grown up so much, she misses you." A shadow crossed her face. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she whispered. "I'm not the person I was." "Neither am I," I said, my voice breaking. "But we're still family. We can try." She looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she said again, and I knew she meant it, even if it wasn't enough. We sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights flickering on one by one. I wanted to hold her, to never let her go again, but I knew that some distances couldn't be crossed in a single afternoon. There were wounds that would take time to heal, questions that might never have answers. As darkness settled, she stood, smoothing her coat with trembling hands. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. "Will I see you again?" I asked, fear tightening my throat. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try." I watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller against the city lights. I wanted to call out, to beg her to stay, but I stayed silent, letting her go. I didn't know if she would come back or if this was goodbye all over again. But for the first time in years, hope flickered in my chest, a fragile, uncertain thing, but alive. I sat on the bench long after she'd gone, the river whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I didn't have all the answers, not yet, but I knew this was not the end of our story. There was more to come, more pain perhaps, but also the possibility of forgiveness, of understanding, of finding each other again in the spaces between what was lost and what remained. The days after our reunion passed in a haze of restless anticipation and gnawing uncertainty. I waited for my mother to call, to appear at my door, to offer the explanations I'd craved for 5 long years. Instead, I found myself wandering the city, retracing the path we'd walked by the river, hoping for another chance encounter. Each evening I returned home exhausted, my mind swirling with questions and half-formed memories. It was a week before I heard from her again. The phone rang late, the hour when the world is quiet and secrets feel heavier. Her voice was thin, almost hesitant. "Can we meet?" she asked. "There's a park near the old library, tomorrow at noon." I agreed, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The next day I arrived early, the autumn air crisp and sharp. I sat on a bench beneath a maple tree, watching the leaves drift down in lazy spirals. When my mother appeared, she looked smaller than I remembered, her coat buttoned tight against the chill. She sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the playground across the path. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I studied her profile, searching for the woman I'd known, the mother who'd taught me to tie my shoes and braid my hair. But there was a distance in her eyes, a shadow I couldn't name. "I owe you the truth," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or as much of it as I can give." I nodded, afraid to break the fragile peace between us. She took a deep breath, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. "After your father died, I tried to hold everything together. For you, for Emily, for myself. But I was drowning. Every day felt like I was walking through fog, pretending to be strong when all I wanted was to disappear. I remembered those years, the way she moved through the house like a ghost, her laughter growing rarer, her silences longer. I'd been so wrapped up in my own grief, my own responsibilities, that I hadn't seen how much she was struggling. I started volunteering at the shelter downtown, she continued. At first, it was just a way to get out of the house, to feel useful. But I met people there, women who'd lost everything, who had no one to turn to. Their stories were so much like mine, and yet so much worse. I wanted to help them, to give them what I couldn't give myself. She paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears. One night, a woman came in. Her name was Lila. She was running from someone, terrified, with nowhere to go. I let her stay with me, just for a few days, I thought. But it became clear she was in real danger. I tried to help her, but I got in over my head. There were threats, people watching the house. I was scared, for her and for you. A memory surfaced, coming home late one evening to find my mother peering through the curtains, her face pale, her hands shaking. I'd asked if she was all right, and she'd brushed me off, saying she was just tired. I'd believed her, never questioning the fear in her eyes. I thought if I left, they'd leave you alone, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I could draw them away, keep you safe. I didn't know how to say goodbye. I was ashamed and I was afraid, so I just left. Anger flared in my chest, hot and sharp. You could have told me, I said, my voice shaking. We could have figured it out together. Instead, you let me think you were dead. You let Emily grieve for you. You let us fall apart. She flinched, her shoulders curling inward. I know, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now how much I hurt you. I can't change what I did. We sat in silence, the weight of her confession settling between us. I wanted to scream, to demand more answers, to make her feel the pain I'd carried for so long. But as I looked at her, older, frailer, haunted by her own regrets, I felt my anger begin to soften, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I spent years blaming myself, I said quietly. I thought I'd done something to drive you away. I replayed every argument, every harsh word. I hated you, and I hated myself for hating you. She reached for my hand, her touch tentative. I never stopped loving you, she whispered. Not for a single day. A memory flashed, my mother sitting at the kitchen table, her diary open, her pen moving across the page. I'd always wondered what she wrote, what secrets she kept locked away. Now, I realized how much she'd carried alone, how much she'd sacrificed in the name of love. I wish you trusted me, I said, tears slipping down my cheeks. I wish you'd let me help you. She squeezed my hand, her own tears falling. I didn't know how. My mother was the same, always hiding her pain, pretending everything was fine. I learned to keep secrets, to bear my burdens alone. I thought that was strength. We sat together, the past unfolding between us in fragments, memories of laughter and loss, of words spoken and unspoken. I saw now how the wounds of one generation can bleed into the next, how the patterns of silence and sacrifice are passed down like heirlooms. I want to try, I said finally. To forgive you, to forgive myself, but I need time. She nodded, her eyes full of gratitude and sorrow. I'll wait, as long as it takes. We parted with a hug, tentative but real, the first step toward healing. As I walked home, I thought of all the women in my family, my mother, her mother, myself, each of us shaped by love and loss, by secrets kept and truths finally spoken. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew this. The only way forward was through honesty, through forgiveness, through the slow, patient work of mending what had been broken. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, my mother's diary open before me. I wrote a letter to her, to myself, to the generations of women who had come before. I promised to break the cycle, to speak my truth, to choose love over fear. And as I wrote, I felt the first stirrings of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness, guiding me home. When I finally told Emily the truth about her grandmother, about the years of silence, the secret life, the reasons for her disappearance, her reaction was swift and sharp, a storm I should have seen coming. She listened in stony silence as I recounted my conversation with my mother, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw clenched. When I finished, she stared at me for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So she just left? Emily's voice was brittle, each word edged with disbelief and hurt. She abandoned us because she was scared? And you're just... What, okay with that now? I shook my head, struggling to find the right words. No, I'm not okay with it. But I'm trying to understand. She thought she was protecting us, even if it was the wrong way. Emily scoffed, turning away. That's not protection. That's cowardice. She let us think she was dead. She let you fall apart. She let me grow up thinking love just disappears when things get hard. Her words cut deep, echoing the anger I'd carried for so long. I wanted to defend my mother, to explain the fear and desperation that had driven her, but I knew how hollow those explanations would sound. I remembered my own rage, the nights I'd lain awake cursing her name, the years I'd spent building walls around my heart to keep the pain at bay. I know you're angry, I said quietly. I was too. I still am sometimes. But holding on to that anger, it only hurts us more. Emily's eyes flashed. Easy for you to say. You got to see her again. You got your answers. What about me? She never even tried to find me. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her face crumpling. I needed her, Mom. When I was lost, when I was scared, when you couldn't get out of bed for days. I needed her, and she was gone. And you, her voice broke. You were gone too in your own way. Her accusation landed with a force I hadn't expected. I thought back to those dark months after my mother disappeared, how I'd retreated into myself, shutting out the world, shutting out my own daughter. I'd been so consumed by grief and guilt that I hadn't seen how much Emily was suffering, how much she needed me to be present, to be strong. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice thick with regret. I should have been there for you. I was so lost in my own pain I didn't see yours. Emily wiped her eyes, her anger softening just a little. I know it wasn't easy, but it felt like I lost both of you at once. I had to grow up fast. I had to take care of you when you were supposed to take care of me. Her words stung, but I knew she was right. I'd leaned on her more than I should have, expecting her to fill the void my mother left behind. I'd let my grief become a wall between us, one that neither of us knew how to climb. I can't change the past, I said, my voice trembling. But I want to do better. I want to be here for you now, in whatever way you need. Emily looked at me, her expression torn between hope and hurt. I don't know if I can forgive her or you. Not yet. That's all right, I said gently. Take your time. I'm not asking you to forgive, just to let yourself feel whatever you need to feel. We've all been hurt. We all have scars. For a while, we sat in silence, the distance between us both familiar and unbearable. I thought of my mother, of the choices she'd made, the secrets she'd kept. I thought of my own failures, the ways I'd repeated the same patterns, passing down pain instead of healing. I saw now how easy it was to become trapped by the past, to let old wounds dictate the shape of our lives. Later that night, I found myself alone in the kitchen, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a cup of tea, the ritual soothing in its familiarity. I thought of the generations of women in my family, my mother, myself, Emily, each of us shaped by loss, by longing, by the ache of love withheld or withdrawn. I realized then that healing wouldn't come all at once. It would be slow, uneven, full of setbacks and small victories. It would require honesty, patience, and a willingness to face the pain we'd all tried so hard to bury. I made a silent promise to Emily, to my mother, to myself. I would not run from the hard conversations. I would not hide behind silence or pride. I would do the work however long it took to mend what had been broken. As I sipped my tea, I felt the first stirrings of hope, a fragile thing, but real. The fractures in our family were deep, but they were not beyond repair. We were still here, still trying, still bound by love, however imperfect. And that, I realized, was enough to begin again. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that seemed to wash the world clean, when I found myself drawn to the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I hadn't opened it in years, not since the first desperate weeks after my mother disappeared, when I'd searched every corner of the house for clues. Now, as the rain tapped gently against the window, I felt a quiet urge to revisit the past, not to find answers, but to remember. Inside the chest, beneath a stack of faded quilts and a box of family photographs, I found my mother's diary. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges, but her handwriting was as familiar as my own. I sat on the floor, the diary in my lap, and for a long moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of all it contained. I opened to a random page, and her words greeted me like an old friend. She wrote of ordinary things, grocery lists, garden plans, recipes she wanted to try. But woven between the mundane were glimpses of her inner life, her fears and hopes, her longing for connection. I read entries from the months after my father died, her grief raw and unfiltered. She wrote of sleepless nights, of feeling invisible, of the crushing responsibility of holding the family together. One entry caught my eye. dated just weeks before she left. "I am so tired," she wrote. "I want to be strong for them, but I feel like I'm disappearing. I wish I could tell her how much I need her, how much I miss being needed. I wish I could be honest, but I don't want to be a burden." Tears blurred the words as I read, the ache in my chest both familiar and new. For so long I'd seen my mother's disappearance as a betrayal, a wound that refused to heal. But now, reading her words, I saw the depth of her pain, the loneliness she'd carried in silence. I realized how much she'd sacrificed, how hard she'd tried to protect us, even if her choices had left scars. As I turned the pages, I found another entry, written the night before she left. "I hope one day she'll understand. I hope she'll forgive me. I love her more than I can say, but I can't stay, not like this. I need to find myself again, before there's nothing left to give." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. For the first time I saw my mother not as the architect of my pain, but as a woman struggling to survive her own. I thought of all the times I'd judged her, all the anger I'd nursed, all the ways I'd let my grief define me. I realized I'd been waiting for her to make things right, to heal the wounds she'd left behind. But healing, I saw now, was something I had to choose for myself. I stood and walked to the window, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass. The world outside was gray and blurred, but I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. I understood, finally, that vengeance, holding on to my anger, demanding apologies, waiting for her to fix what was broken, would only keep me trapped in the past. If I wanted peace, I had to let go. I had to seek understanding, not retribution. That evening I called Emily. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady. "I found something today. Grandma's diary. I think you should read it. I think it might help." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I don't know if I'm ready." "That's all right," I said gently. "Whenever you are. I just wanted you to know I'm done being angry. I want to understand. I want to move forward." Emily was quiet for a long time. "Me too," she said finally, her voice soft. "I'm tired of being angry." After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the diary open beside me. I wrote a letter to my mother, not to send, but to say the things I'd never said. I told her I forgave her. I told her I understood. I told her I was ready to live my own life, to let go of the past, and embrace whatever came next. As the rain eased and the sky began to clear, I felt a lightness in my chest, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, old wounds that would ache on quiet nights. But I also knew I was no longer powerless. I could choose how to carry my story. I could choose compassion over blame, hope over resentment. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of my mother, not as the woman who left, but as the woman who loved, who tried, who failed, and who, in her own way, had given me the strength to begin again. The days after reading my mother's diary were filled with a restless energy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I carried her words with me everywhere, feeling their weight in my pocket, their ache in my chest. I knew I couldn't keep them to myself forever. The truth was a living thing now, pressing at the edges of my life, demanding to be seen. But I also knew that sharing it would change everything, not just for me, but for Emily, for the family, for the fragile peace we'd begun to rebuild. I sat at the kitchen table, the diary open before me, my hands wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. I thought of all the secrets my mother had kept, the sacrifices she'd made, the pain she'd endured in silence. I thought of Emily's anger, her longing for answers, her need to make sense of the years we'd lost. I thought of the rest of the family, my aunts, my cousins, the people who had whispered and speculated, who had built their own stories around my mother's disappearance. If I told them everything, I could finally clear my mother's name. I could explain the choices she'd made, the dangers she'd faced, the reasons she'd left. I could give Emily the closure she craved, the understanding she deserved. But I would also be exposing my mother's deepest wounds, her moments of weakness, her desperate attempts to protect us. I would be turning her pain into a spectacle, inviting judgment from people who had never known the full story. The decision felt impossible. I wanted to do right by everyone, to heal the rifts in our family, to honor my mother's memory. But I also wanted to protect her, to keep her secrets safe, to shield her from the harsh light of other people's opinions. I wondered what she would want, if she would thank me for telling the truth, or beg me to let the past rest. I spent hours weighing my options, turning them over in my mind like stones in a river. I wrote lists, arguments for and against, but nothing brought me closer to an answer. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't stay silent forever. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how hard we tried to bury it. That evening Emily came over, her face drawn and serious. She sat across from me, her eyes searching mine. "Have you decided?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, feeling the weight of her question. "I don't know," I admitted. "If I tell everyone, it might help them understand. But it might also hurt her memory. I don't want to betray her, but I don't want to keep lying either." Emily reached for my hand, her grip warm and steady. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But I think people deserve to know the truth. Maybe it's the only way we can all move forward." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. I sat in the quiet house, the diary open in front of me, and tried to imagine what my mother would say if she were here. I remembered her last words to me, the hope in her eyes, the longing for forgiveness. I realized that, in the end, the choice was mine alone. As night fell, I made my decision. I would gather the family, tell them everything, her struggles, her sacrifices, her reasons for leaving. I would trust them to understand, to show compassion, to see my mother not as a mystery or a cautionary tale, but as a woman who had done her best in an impossible situation. I closed the diary, my heart pounding with fear and resolve. Tomorrow, I would call everyone together. Tomorrow, I would speak the truth no matter the cost. But as I turned out the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, a new worry crept in. Would the family accept what I had to say? Would they forgive, or would old wounds only deepen? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of my choice pressing down on me. In the darkness, I realized that this was the moment everything would change. The past was no longer just mine to carry. Tomorrow, I would open the door to all of it: love, pain, forgiveness, and the unknown. The day of the family gathering dawned gray and heavy, the sky threatening rain. I spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, setting out extra chairs in the living room, brewing pot after pot of tea, and arranging the diary and a stack of tissues on the coffee table. My hands shook as I worked, but I felt a strange sense of calm beneath the anxiety, a quiet certainty that this was the right thing to do, no matter how painful. One by one, they arrived. Emily was first, her face pale but determined. Then my sister, Ruth, with her husband trailing behind, their eyes wary. My cousin Margaret, who had always been closest to my mother, hugged me tightly at the door. Even my Aunt Helen, who rarely left her own home, made the effort, her cane tapping softly on the floor as she entered. The room filled with the low hum of voices, the clink of teacups, the rustle of coats being shed and folded over chairs. When everyone had settled, I stood at the front of the room, the diary in my hands. The chatter faded, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. I looked at each face, some anxious, some skeptical, some already bracing for disappointment. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their hopes and fears pressing in on me. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. "I know this isn't easy, but I think it's time we talked about what really happened to Mum. I've spent years searching for answers, and I finally have them. I want to share them with you, not to reopen old wounds, but to help us all heal." I opened the diary, reading aloud passages that revealed my mother's struggles after my father's death, her loneliness, her sense of invisibility, her desperate attempts to hold the family together. I spoke of her work at the shelter, the women she tried to help, the danger that crept into her life when she sheltered Lila. I told them about the threats, the fear, the impossible choice she faced between staying and risking our safety, or leaving to protect us. As I spoke, I watched the faces around me shift: shock, disbelief, sorrow, and in some, a dawning understanding. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed to her mouth. Margaret wept openly, her shoulders shaking. Helen sat very still, her gaze fixed on the diary as if it might reveal even more secrets. When I finished, the room was silent. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ruth spoke, her voice trembling. "Why didn't she tell us? Why did she think she had to do it all alone?" I shook my head, feeling the old ache of regret. She was afraid. She thought she was protecting us. She didn't want to be a burden. She learned to hide her pain, just like her mother before her. Margaret wiped her eyes. "I wish I'd known. I would have helped her. I would have done anything." Emily, sitting beside me, reached for my hand. We all would have, but we can't change the past. We can only decide what we do with the truth now. There was a long pause, the air thick with grief and the possibility of forgiveness. I felt the urge to apologize for my mother, to defend her choices, but I stopped myself. Instead, I stood a little taller, feeling the strength of my own voice. I know some of you are angry, I said. I was too, but I've come to understand that Mom did the best she could with what she had. She made mistakes, but she loved us. She sacrificed more than we ever knew. I won't let her memory be defined by her absence. I choose to remember her for her courage, her kindness, and her love. Helen spoke then, her voice surprisingly strong. We all carry wounds from the past. Some are visible, some are not. What matters is what we do with them. I forgive her. I hope we all can. The conversation that followed was raw and honest. Old grievances surfaced, resentments about childhood slights, misunderstandings, the ways we'd all failed each other. But for the first time, there was space for those wounds to be acknowledged, for the pain to be named without blame. We spoke of our own struggles, our own moments of weakness, the ways we'd learned to hide our pain. Emily turned to me, her eyes shining. You did the right thing, Mom. Thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for not letting her story end in silence. I felt a surge of pride, not just for myself, but for all of us, for our willingness to face the truth, to sit with the discomfort, to choose understanding over judgment. I realized that this was what dignity looked like, not perfection, not the absence of pain, but the courage to face it together. As the afternoon wore on, the mood in the room shifted. The tension eased, replaced by a sense of relief, even hope. We shared stories of my mother, her laughter, her stubbornness, her fierce love. We remembered the good times, the moments of joy that had been overshadowed by loss. We allowed ourselves to grieve, but also to celebrate the woman she had been. When the gathering finally broke up, there were hugs and promises to stay in touch, to be more honest, to lean on each other when the weight of the past felt too heavy. I watched my family leave, their faces softer, their burdens lighter. I stood alone in the quiet house, the diary pressed to my heart. My mother had faced the consequences of her actions, not through punishment, but through the truth. And in speaking that truth, I had reclaimed my own dignity, my own agency. I had chosen understanding, and in doing so, I had opened the door to healing, not just for myself, but for all of us. A week after the family gathering, my mother called. Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as if she feared she might be intruding. "Would you like to come over for tea?" she asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything we'd been through. Years of silence, pain, and longing. I said yes, my heart fluttering with nerves and hope. Her apartment was small and spare, but she'd made it her own. A vase of fresh daisies sat on the windowsill, and the scent of baking bread lingered in the air. She greeted me at the door with a hesitant smile, her eyes searching mine for any sign of anger or resentment. I stepped inside, and for a moment we simply stood there, unsure of how to begin again. She led me to the kitchen, where the kettle was already whistling. She reached for her old teacup, the one with the blue forget-me-nots chipped at the rim. I smiled, remembering how she'd always insisted tea tasted better from that cup. She poured for both of us, her hand steady despite the tremor in her voice. We sat at the table, the diary between us. I traced the worn leather cover with my finger, feeling the history it held. For a while we sipped our tea in silence, the quiet not uncomfortable, but full of things waiting to be said. Finally she spoke. "I read what you wrote," she said, her voice trembling. "The letter you left in the diary. Thank you for forgiving me. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm grateful." I looked at her, really looked at her, the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the vulnerability in her posture. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," I said softly. "It's about letting go. I carried so much anger for so long, and it only made me lonelier. I don't want to live like that anymore." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I wish I'd been braver. I wish I'd told you the truth from the start. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was just running away from my own pain." I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. Her skin was warm, her grip gentle but sure. "We all run in our own ways," I said. "But we're here now. That's what matters." We opened the diary together, turning the pages slowly. She read aloud some of her entries, her voice wavering as she revisited old wounds. She spoke of my father, of the loneliness that followed his death, of the fear that she would never be enough for me or for herself. I listened, my heart aching for the woman she had been, so strong on the outside, so fragile within. I shared my own memories, the moments I'd missed her most, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep wishing she would come home. I told her about Emily, about the ways we'd both struggled, about the anger that had nearly consumed us. She listened, her eyes never leaving mine, her hand never letting go. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, we found ourselves laughing at old stories, remembering the good times that had been buried beneath years of sorrow. We spoke of forgiveness, not as a single act, but as a process, a choice we would have to make again and again. We acknowledged the pain, but we also celebrated the resilience that had brought us back to each other. I realized then that forgiveness was not about erasing the past or pretending the hurt had never happened. It was about accepting the truth in all its messiness and imperfection, and choosing to move forward anyway. It was about seeing my mother not just as the woman who had left, but as the woman who had loved, who had tried, who had failed, and who was still here, asking for another chance. As the tea grew cold and the shadows lengthened, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that we were both stronger than we had ever known. We had survived loss, betrayal, and the long, lonely years of absence. We had found our way back to each other, not because we were perfect, but because we were willing to try. Before I left, my mother pressed the diary into my hands. "Keep it," she said. "Let it remind you that even when things seem broken, there's always a way to begin again." I hugged her, holding her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine. "I love you, Mom," I whispered. "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Always." As I walked home beneath the evening sky, I thought about the journey we had taken, the pain, the anger, the slow, patient work of healing. I knew there would be more hard days ahead, more moments of doubt and regret. But I also knew that forgiveness was a gift we could give ourselves, a way to honor the love that had survived even the darkest of times. In the end, it wasn't the tea or the diary, or even the words we shared that mattered most. It was the choice to sit together, to listen, to forgive, and to hope. It was the quiet, stubborn strength of two women who refused to let the past define them, who chose instead to build something new from the pieces of what had been lost. In the weeks that followed my mother's return, I found myself moving through the world with a new sense of purpose. The heaviness that had pressed on my chest for years began to lift, replaced by something lighter, tentative but real. I realized that for so long I had let my pain define me. I had worn it like a second skin, letting it dictate my choices, my relationships, even the way I saw myself. But now, with the truth finally spoken and forgiveness offered, I felt the first stirrings of freedom. I started small. I cleared out the old cedar chest, letting go of things I'd clung to out of habit rather than love. I filled my home with fresh flowers, their colors bright against the pale walls. I took long walks in the park, breathing in the crisp air, feeling my body grow stronger with each step. I began to write again, not just in my mother's diary, but in my own journal, filling the pages with hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. I wrote not to make sense of the past, but to claim my place in the present. Emily and I found our way back to each other, slowly and carefully. Our conversations were honest, sometimes raw, but always real. We talked about the years we'd lost, the ways we'd hurt each other, the things we still needed from one another. I apologized for the times I'd leaned too heavily on her, for the ways I'd let my grief overshadow her childhood. She forgave me, not all at once, but in small, everyday gestures, a shared cup of coffee, a walk around the block, a text message just to say goodnight. We set new boundaries, learning to respect each other's space and needs. I stopped expecting her to fill the void my mother had left, and she stopped trying to fix my sadness. We became at last two women standing side by side, each responsible for her own happiness. There were still hard days, moments when old wounds ached and tempers flared, but we faced them together with honesty and compassion. I also began to see myself differently. For years I had measured my worth by the roles I played: daughter, mother, caretaker, survivor. I had believed that love meant sacrifice, that strength meant silence, that dignity meant never asking for help. But as I rebuilt my life, I discovered a new kind of strength, the courage to speak my truth, to set boundaries, to ask for what I needed. I learned that I was worthy of love and respect, not because of what I could give, but simply because I existed. The future remained uncertain. My mother and I were still learning how to be in each other's lives, still navigating the delicate balance between closeness and independence. Emily was building a life of her own, making choices I didn't always understand, but tried to support. Our family was not what it once was, and perhaps never would be again. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Hope, I realized, was not a promise that everything would be perfect. It was the quiet belief that healing was possible, that love could survive even the deepest wounds, that we could choose again and again to move forward. It was the willingness to open my heart, to risk disappointment, to trust that I was strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and rose, I sat on my porch with Emily and my mother. We sipped tea, sharing stories and laughter, the air warm with possibility. I looked at the two women beside me, one who had given me life, the other who had taught me how to live it, and I felt a deep, abiding gratitude. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt and fear. But I also knew that I was no longer defined by what I had lost. I was defined by what I had reclaimed, my voice, my agency, my sense of self. I was at last my own person, whole and worthy, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. And as the stars began to appear, one by one I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I will not let the past steal my joy. I will honor my story, with all its pain and beauty. I will choose hope, every single day. If you've listened this far, I want to thank you, not just for hearing my story, but for holding space for the pain and the hope that live side by side in every family. I know I am not alone in carrying wounds that are slow to heal, or in longing for a reconciliation that sometimes feels just out of reach. Maybe you too have lost someone you loved, or found yourself standing at the edge of forgiveness, uncertain whether to take that first step. Maybe you've wondered if healing is possible after so much has been broken. I want you to know that it is. Healing is not a straight line, nor is it a single moment of revelation. It is a journey, made up of small choices, choosing to listen, to speak, to forgive, to try again. It is the courage to sit with your pain, to let yourself feel it fully, and then to let it soften little by little as you open your heart to the possibility of something new. For years, I believed that dignity meant never showing my wounds, never admitting how much I hurt. But I have learned that true dignity comes from honesty, from allowing ourselves to be seen, even in our most vulnerable moments. It comes from reaching out, from asking for help, from sharing our stories so that others might find comfort in knowing they are not alone. Community is built on these shared stories. When we speak our truth, we give others permission to do the same. We create a space where pain can be witnessed, where healing can begin. I have been humbled by the kindness of friends and strangers alike, by the way a simple act of listening can become a lifeline. If you are struggling, I hope you will reach out to a friend, a family member, or even to someone you've never met. Your voice matters. Your story matters. I have come to believe that resilience is not about never falling, but about rising each time we do. It is about finding strength in the broken places, about choosing hope even when the future is uncertain. It is about honoring the love that endures, even when relationships are complicated, even when forgiveness feels impossible. We are all works in progress, shaped by the losses we carry and the healing we allow. If you are holding on to anger, or regret, or grief that feels too heavy to bear, I invite you to set it down, even for a moment. Breathe. Remember that you are not defined by what you have lost, but by what you choose to reclaim. There is power in your story, and there is power in your healing. As I look back on my own journey, I see not just the pain, but the beauty that has come from it. The laughter shared over tea, the quiet moments of understanding, the strength I never knew I had. I see the ways my family has grown, not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. I see the possibility of new beginnings, even after years of silence. So, wherever you are in your own story, I hope you will keep going. I hope you will find the courage to forgive, to reach out, to begin again. I hope you will remember that you are worthy of love, of dignity, of healing. And I hope you will share your story, because someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for walking this path with me. Your story matters too.